Hey guys, hello everyone. This is International Master Asaf Givon here with you today. Today I wanted to make a little bit of a special video. It's very different from the normal format of game analysis videos that I do. I'm going to take some games from the World Championship match, the recent one between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen, and using some of their games in this match, I'm going to address a topic which I think is not being discussed too much in chess literature or online, which is the topic of critical moments in chess and decision making. So I've actually added to this video, I've added the clocks of the players during the game. So together with the moves and the times on the clock that the players consumed in every move that they made, we will try together to understand the mindset of the players during the game and why they choose to use it in some positions more time than in other positions, and why is it so important to know how to manage your time and to know when is a critical moment arises in a chess game. It's super important in order not to just waste our time continuously on every move. And I must say that this topic is very much close to my heart, because I remember that as a child, as a teenager, when I was playing games, I was a little bit inconfident in myself, and I kept thinking for a very long time almost on every move, which a lot of time caused me to get into pretty severe time troubles, and it had a direct effect on my games. So I chose here to take in this first video the first game of the match. So in this match, Caruana was playing with white, Carlsen was playing with black. Now I want also to stress that this was Caruana's first game ever in a World Championship match, so it's understandable that he consumed much more time than his opponent. Carlsen already played quite a few matches in his life. He's already kind of used to the atmosphere of such a match. So white started with e4. Black started with c5. This was probably the first small surprise for Caruana in the opening, because I think very few people anticipated that Carlsen was going to choose the Sicilian defense in this match as his weapon against e4, because Carlsen was, and still is, very much well known in his ability to outplay his opponents in very quiet and, let's say, static positions, and he's not usually choosing very sharp weapons against most of his opponents. But okay, Caruana was not too much kind of distracted by this. So the first few moves are being played fairly quickly. You can see these on the clocks. Bishop b5, it's called a Rossolimo Sicilian, a very common choice at this level. Caruana has already implemented this system quite a few times in the past. Both players continue to play quick. g6, it's the main line, trying to get the bishop developed on g7. Bishop takes c6, creating some double pawns for black. d3, bishop g7, h3, these are all very standard theory moves. White is trying to stop black from placing his bishop on g4. Knight to f6, knight to c3. Black played knight d7. This is still theory. The knight is kind of clearing the way for this bishop on the long diagonal, and perhaps preparing to put his pawn on e5. Later on we might also see that this knight might be maneuvering itself through f8 to e6 to d4. We will see it later. Bishop e3. So I'm not going to stop at this point, even though Caruana was thinking, as you can see, for about 4 minutes about this move. But I don't really consider this to be a very critical point. I think Caruana was kind of just debating between himself whether to stick to the main line that he knows. Perhaps he wanted to try and avoid mainline theory, as he was clearly less prepared than Carlsen in this game. But okay, e5, castle short, b6. To my knowledge, this is not the most common move in this position. to my knowledge, most of the black players, when they want to protect the pawn on c5, they play the move queen to e7, followed by eventually the maneuver knight to f8 to e6. So the move b6 might have came as a small surprise to Caruana, probably not a very big one, but still you can see that this was the first time in the game that Caruana used pretty long time to think. So from 35 minutes he went down to 17 hour and 17 minutes on the clock. So I think in this position we can define the first type of critical moment that chess players face in a chess game, which is, we can call it the end of the preparation critical moment. So for any chess player, probably at any level, there is a certain boundary, like a limit, where his theoretical knowledge ends, or the opponent decides to play a new move. And usually this is pretty much of like a pretty critical moment in the game, because this is like the first time in the game that you actually need to think about your moves rather than just blitzing out moves that you already know in advance. And typically players tend to spend quite a few minutes thinking about their moves, let's say in the first move after the end of the preparation, and sometimes also in the next few ones. In this case, the move knight h2 in itself, it's not a new idea. The idea in itself is very common. The knight itself tries to maneuver itself perhaps later on to g4 in order to participate in some attack in the center or the king side. But mainly the point of this move is to prepare the move, whoops, not this, but f4, to break in the center, to open up the f file for the white rooks. Still, it's much more common for white to play first queen to d2, threatening to exchange the bishop to bishop h6, and only then go knight h2. So I'm also classifying this move, the reason that Caruana was thinking for quite a while about this move, is that he wanted to slightly step out of Carlsen's preparation in the opening. So he chose intentionally not to play the most expected move. That's why he kind of took his time to think how he can deviate from the opponent's preparation. So this is the first type of a critical moment in the game, the end of the preparation. Now, this was probably not the case for Carlsen. He was still in his preparation, so he continued to play, I believe, pretty quickly. He played the move knight f8 within about 5 minutes, not too long of a think. f4, just continuing the plan. You can still see that even though the move f4 is pretty, I wouldn't say forced, but that's the the principled move which Caruana was preparing the move before. He still took about 10 minutes to play it, and I think the only reason for it is his nervousness because of this being the first game of the match. He was still probably adjusting to the atmosphere. In reality, he should have played this move much faster, and you can see that in the next couple of moves Carlsen is going to gain quite a substantial advantage on the clock, because he's playing a little bit more confidently, while Caruana is kind of taking a lot of time to think about moves which are arguably fairly obvious. So f4, black really must take this pawn, because otherwise this pawn might become pretty dangerous when it comes to f5. Also, this move has the benefit of activating the black bishop. White chose to take with the rook. This was played fairly quickly because Caruana was already preparing this move when he played the move f4. So you see that sometimes a player might be thinking about a certain move for a fairly long period of time, but then he's going to play a couple of fast moves after it. So for example, he calculates his move, let's say on move number 10, and move number 11, 12, 13 and 14 he's playing very quickly because he already prepared them in advance when he was thinking about move number 10. So I think this is the case here. Here Carlsen plays maybe a move which might come as a small surprise, bishop e6. The reason I'm saying it, because he made this maneuver knight d7 and knight f8, so many people expected him to play now the move knight to e6, which is the more obvious move, attacking the rook and preparing to land this knight on d4. But the advantage of the move bishop e6 is that it's practically completely safeguard this pawn on f7, which is perhaps a target for white to attack, so he wants to deal with this. Now, once again, Caruana is taking a little bit his time to think, plays Rook F2 after 5 minutes. This is a prophylactic move, just getting the rook out of the danger zone, you can say. And this move actually had a pretty good effect, because this was the first time in the game that Carlsen really took a little bit more time than normal to think. So on his next move, Carlsen spent, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 minutes. Yes, so the move h6. So I think that at this point we can classify the reason why Carlsen was thinking for 10 minutes. So this was a critical moment for him, because once again he was now out of his preparation. And as you can see, the end of the preparation can be very different between both players. White ended up his knowledge maybe 2 or 3 moves ago, while Carlsen was still slightly blitzing out his moves. Which makes sense, because Carlsen was the one to surprise Caruana in the opening a little bit, because Caruana had really no way to know which kind of opening Carlsen is going to choose against e4. So it makes sense that this happened. And now came a move that I consider to be very, very natural, very, very obvious, but still, look at the clock. So after the move queen d2, Caruana only had 48 minutes left, so he used on the move queen d2 quite a bit of time, and I considered it to be way too much for a move such as queen d2. To me, this is not seems to be like a critical position, so it does not deserve such a long thing. I think a move like queen d2 should be played fairly quicker. But this is the spirit or the style of Caruana. He is a perfectionist. He likes, in every position, to explore all of the possibilities and try to find the absolute best move, which is arguably very good, but also sometimes not very practical, because you also need to take care of your time on the clock for later stages in the game, and we would see that for both players the time on the clock is definitely going to be very crucial in the later stages of the game. Now came another moment where Carlsen decided to stop a little bit and take more time to think than normal. The move g5. Now you see that he thought about this move something like 7 minutes. You cannot say it's a very long period of time, but it's still, we can call it a semi-critical moment, because Carlsen knew that his pawn on h6 might get under attack very soon with the move like knight g4. He also knew that his knight on f8 cannot stay there forever, and since the bishop is kind of taking its spot away, he had to think how to relocate his knight. And probably this is why he took slightly more time to think than normal, because he had to realize two things. He had to realize where exactly he wanted to place his knight. This is one thing that might take a little bit of time. Should I try to get it to g6? Should I try to get it to d7 and to e5? Should I play knight maybe h7? So all of these considerations take time. And also the move g5 is a slightly weakening move on the king side. So it's a slightly daring move. For example, now both of these squares on h5 and f5 are no longer being defended by a black pawn. So Carlsen had to evaluate correctly the consequences of such a move like g5. He had to evaluate that the white knights cannot approach those squares very quickly, and it also took him a little bit of time, because for example he had to realize that if white plays a move like knight d2, trying to get to g3 and then to once again f5 or h5, then he can stop these moves fairly easily, either by a move like queen d6 or a move like bishop e5, both controlling this square in g3. So he was not particularly afraid of this. So Caruana played the move Rook to F1 fairly quickly. It's a pretty obvious move, just developing his last piece into the game. So there's not too much point in thinking about this move too much. And now Carlsen took another little thing here. If I'm not mistaken, about 10 moves or 15 moves about his next move. Yeah, 10 minutes. Queen d6. Now, why did Carlsen chose to use 10 minutes from his time about this move, Queen d6? We have a couple of explanations for this. First of all, I think that Carlsen, his first instinct was to play the move knight to g6, which was the whole point of his last move, pawn to g5. But what I think happened is that when he started thinking about the move knight to g6, he either started worrying about the white knight very quickly coming to f6 and bothering his life a little bit, so he wanted to develop his queen in order to be able to very quickly castle long. The second explanation, that even when he realized finally that he wanted to develop his queen, he was not sure of where exactly should he put it. So he can put it on c7, on d7, on d6, on e7. So a lot of options. So here we come into another type of a critical moment. We can call it a critical moment of a wide choice of a variety of options. Black had to evaluate correctly which square was better for his queen out of these 3 candidates, or even 4 candidates, and this was a little bit time consuming for him. So in a position where you have a lot of options, obviously it means that you will probably more likely to use more time. Eventually he chose to go to d6. I like this decision. He's keeping control over this diagonal, which is once again important to control this square on g3. He's also eyeballing the d file and of course preparing long castling, which is important. White played knight to g4 after quite a think, about 15 minutes about this move. And I think the reason for this is because this move is potentially initiating a change of pawn structure, which is a third, if I'm not mistaken, a third type of a critical point, maybe even a fourth, since the beginning of this video. Because after the move knight g4, if black wants, he can cripple white pawn structure with the move bishop takes g4. So he had to evaluate correctly what is going on after the move pawn takes g4. On the one hand, white's pawn structure on the king side is ruined, but black gave up this very important defender of the light squares, and now the f7 pawn is under attack. And Caruana had to evaluate correctly, which might once again might have taken him, probably should have taken him less time, but once again he was probably very nervous from the first game of the match. And he had to evaluate, and he did it correctly, that the weakening of the white structure is less important than black losing its very important defender of the light squares. So that was probably the reason why it took pretty much a long time to play the move knight g4. And Carlsen on his side was pretty much ready with his response to this move. He played the move long castles, only thinking 2 minutes. You can see that at this point Carlsen has the advantage of 22 minutes on the clock. It's a pretty significant advantage. This was his whole point of the move queen d6. He wanted to escape white's attempts to attack him. Knight f6 was played fairly quickly. And now knight d7 was also played pretty quickly. I think this is also a fairly logical and obvious move. Black cannot really stand this strong knight on f6. We must try to exchange it. And here comes another point where Caruana, I think at this point Caruana was already starting to feel a little bit nervous on the clock. So from this point on, he obviously cannot take very long things when he only have about 30 minutes on the clock. But still, he played the move knight to h5 after a thought of about 5 minutes out of his remaining 30 minutes. It's a pretty big percentage of time. And once again, the reason for this is this was a semi-critical moment. So we come to the probably the fifth type of critical moment in a chess game, which is the piece exchange. In this position, white is offered to exchange the pieces, and he needs to evaluate pretty much whether this exchange favors him or not. This is the explanation why it took Caruana, let's say, a little bit of time to think about his next move. Eventually chose not to exchange, and I think he did correctly. First of all, the knight on h5 is a pretty strong piece. It's also hitting the bishop, so white gains a tempo. Black played bishop to e5, a pretty solid square in the center of the board. And with his next move, Caruana uses another 6 minutes, g4. So this is also a semi-critical point where this move is actually has two things about it, which makes it slightly a difficult decision or a critical decision. First of all, it's slightly weakening the white king, the move g4, and it's also changing the pawn structure. So Caruana had to evaluate both of these things, whether it's worth the risk. But there are also good things about this move. It's stabilizing this knight on h5, it's fixing the black pawns on the king side, so it means they cannot advance forward and attack the white king so easily. Now with his next couple of moves, it came Carlsen's turn to use his time. He played the move f6 after thinking, as you can see, for quite a long time. Once again, the type of decision here which was slightly critical is the change of pawn structure. The black pawn on f6 is no longer being supported by the white bishop, and I think this is why Carlsen had a little bit of time to think whether he wants the e6 bishop to protect the pawn or the e5 bishop to do this. The white time on the clock really was low at this point, so his next three moves he's going to play fairly quickly. b3 after 3 minutes, just a general safe move on the queen side. Bishop to f7 was played quickly to fight against this strong knight on h5. Knight d1 was played also fairly quickly. The knight on c3, as you can see, is not doing too much. He wants to maneuver it perhaps to a better square, perhaps on the king side. And here came another semi-critical moment. Carlsen played knight f8. It's funny because we already saw the move knight f8 in this game. But once again, now he wants to maneuver his knight into a better square. But the reason it took him 10 minutes to do this is because he's sacrificing a pawn. White is now allowed to take on f6, which Caruana took another 7 minutes to play. But Carlsen evaluated correctly that even though he's giving up the pawn, the activation of his knight is more significant. Now the knight is reaching one of these juicy squares in the center, and it's going to give him a very strong initiative. White understood that he has to go back on h5 in order to attack the black bishop on f7, and from this point on, Caruana really is playing very quickly just because he has no choice, and this affects the level of his play. Now we can see that the clock is kind of making his impact on the game. Carlsen takes on h5. This was pretty quickly because he knows he has to give take away the strong piece on h5, and plays knight f4 very quickly. This is the square that he intended to land on long ago. Bishop takes f4. The white pieces cannot really withstand such a strong knight on f4, so he must take it. Pawn takes on f4. And from this moment, Caruana is playing very quickly. Now I'm going to slightly fast forward the next few moves. Rook g2, rook g8, and eventually Carlsen was keeping his pretty steady pace. He had the advantage at this point because the white knight is very passive. Black already has a passed pawn on f4 which can move forward. So definitely the advantage is with black hand. This is why Carlsen started to think maybe slightly more than before, because he wanted to keep his advantage, not to let it slip away. Queen e6, knight f2, rook g8, attacking the queen, knight g4, queen e8. Now you can see that this pawn on h5 is pretty much lost, but white is counting on this strong knight on g4 to be able to hold this position. Caruana at this point is very much slow on the clock. He plays king f2 to escape this dangerous open file. And we must also remember that in these games there is a time control. When you reach move number 40, you get an extra 50 minutes on your clock. And we are on move number 32. So both players are now pretty nervous because they know that they need to make another 8 moves to reach the time control, especially Caruana. And now Caruana plays a very human move, king e2, a move which chess engines pretty much hate, but you cannot blame him. He's once again very low on the clock. He made bad decisions earlier on in the game regarding his time management, so now he's suffering from this. And basically I think the only reason that Carlsen did not win this game came a couple of moves later. So I'm going to fast forward to move number 40. Look at the clocks, by the way. Caruana is already below 1 minute. He's playing his moves very nervously. So this is move number 40. White is playing his move with barely a couple of seconds on the clock, knight h2. And here Carlsen makes the most critical mistake of his game, which deprived him, which kind of took away the victory from him. He decided to take on c3. Now my explanation for this is that Carlsen basically wanted to make a safe move on move number 40. He did not want to take really too much risks when playing his 40th move, because he knew that after playing this move he's getting an increment and he could think more about his position on the next move. So he kind of wanted to play it safe, but with this move he's giving away the victory. As many sources already mentioned it, he could have won by playing a move such as queen g1 with the idea to harass the white king from behind. He was very likely to win this game had he played this move, but once again the time kind of made his own impact on the game, and the game was eventually drawn after the move bishop takes c3, queen takes f4, bishop d4. Black basically was happy about getting this position, but white has one and only source of counterplay which he used to his fullest, rook g3. Now this pawn is lost, but now white has this very strong pass pawn in the center, and this was enough for him in order to save the game. He started to push his pawn, e5, e6, and the game was eventually drawn because black had to give up his h pawn for the e pawn in order to stop it from advancing, and we got a rook endgame where black had the pawn up, but this was not enough for him to win because the rook endgames has a very big drawing tendency, and the game ended up in a draw. So this video is probably already pretty long as it is. Really hope you enjoyed this explanation of this very high profile game, all of the logic between their decision making, their time management, and their understanding of the critical moments in a chess game. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.